WTF is going on in Canadian subreddits? A lot of people are giving great answers here, but let me try and show you what it's like from a first-person perspective. I've seen my food almost double and my rent almost tripled in the last 4 years. A home my friend bought pre-COVID for a down payment of $50,000 now requires a down payment of $120,000. I am paying more per month for an apartment that is about 1/6 the size of my friend's house than he is on his entire house. We don't have enough housing and we can't afford it. And while all this is happening, our government is bringing in hundreds of thousands of immigrants, all looking to compete for the same resources. I'm not anti-immigration, but I am absolutely more concerned about helping Canadians who are born and raised here first before we're trying to incorporate the entire world into our own country. We're being priced out at every level because our government has failed time and time again to solve this housing and cost of living crisis while exacerbating the problem by flooding the country with unprecedented levels of immigration, which is basically adding fuel to the fire. No Canadian I know of hates immigrants. They hate the immigration system. And this isn't even covering the predatory immigration to college pipeline our colleges have allowed to have unchecked. It's bad here, really bad. And people are pissed off. Unfortunately, a lot of that seems to get directed to immigrants who aren't to blame. But our immigration system is absolutely part of the problem. No government in power has addressed housing since the 70s. The other infrastructures being ignored are healthcare, education and transportation. All these things need addressing before immigration can ever happen in any meaningful way. I am Canadian but not living in Canada, so I admittedly haven't had the full experience. But I think the biggest factor in this is that young people are being heavily priced out of housing in every single worthwhile metro area. This is partially true in the US, but there are still pockets of affordability. Canada has a full-on crisis. You need to be in the cities for real jobs, but no one can afford to live in the cities. Trudeau's Liberals have been in power since 2015, so they've had plenty of time to create better housing policies. And they haven't. So, just like how the president gets blamed for everything in the US, the Prime Minister and the sitting government are gonna get blamed for everything wrong happening in Canada. In this case, I think rightfully so. I think the Canadians who are likely to use Reddit, young, are also likely to be getting negatively polarized against the Liberal Party in the current political climate. It's easy to imagine the average Canadian reading the headline, "Trudeau accepts 400,000 new immigrants," and becoming furious. The majority of those immigrants will be moving to Toronto, where it is already exceptionally difficult to find affordable housing. Vancouver is not any better off. Montreal, I hear, is in a somewhat better position. Canada is an incredibly urban country. So although the land is vast and the population is still relatively small, it doesn't feel like that when you're all fighting for the same apartments on the Golden Horseshoe. People are experiencing financial problems and then watching their government, from their perspective, intentionally make them worse. Personally, I think this anger is understandable but misguided. The anger should be directed at bad housing policy and, yes, Trudeau's Liberals, but not immigrants. Immigrants, no matter how new, are Canadians, and they deal with the same affordability issues as everyone else. They are part of the solution, not part of the problem. I think most well-meaning Canadians don't want to be anti-immigrant, but they want their government to make sure that our communities are equipped to handle new people before they're invited. Canada has more similarities to Europe than the US does. In a lot of recent European elections, young voters have been turning out for centre-right and even far-right parties. I believe it happened in Sweden and Germany recently. There is always a pendulum swing from the incumbent government to another ideology. But there's also a pattern of young people becoming more conservative in many areas with perceived immigration issues. I think the next federal elections are going to be extremely interesting to see which way the younger generation throws their support and the consequences of that. The Liberals are not gonna like the results. Canada is a country of 39 million people that has accepted 1.1 million immigrants this year alone, while not building too many apartments and houses. By comparison, the USA country of 335 million, which also accepted 1.1 million immigrants. I am an immigrant myself, but I can't just turn a blind eye to the fact that their country has an absolutely crazy immigration policy. They're allowing almost anyone in without much strategy to it. Please don't let the Looney Tunes distract from valid questioning and criticism of our current immigration policies. We are bringing people into the country hand over fist when we don't have nearly enough homes and doctors for the people who already live here. Seems like the main benefactors of these policies are the corporate elite who don't have to raise wages due to the massive influx of labor. It's deeply concerning as a regular Joe. It's remarkably simple. 3% population growth with zero preparation has resulted in no housing, no access to healthcare, overloaded amenities, overloaded infrastructure, rapidly decaying economy in recession already. It's fraying the social fabric and the resentment is boiling up. Housing issues emo. You've got a generation of educated people unable to afford housing and people are pissed. So, instead of being angry that wages haven't kept up with inflation, anger is turning to immigrants instead. Basically, I as a Canadian believe that Canada accepts way too many immigrants. I couldn't get a minimum wage job. I cannot find any job now. I won't be able to afford a home. Schooling is expensive now and there is so many foreign students. The list goes on. I do support inviting immigrants, just definitely not to this extent unless we have the infrastructure to support our current population. Perhaps it's because immigration to Canada is staggeringly high for a country with a relatively small population. I live on the Canadian border and speak to many Canadians. The concerns they have about the government are legitimate concerns, and many would not even be considered right-wing by any stretch. I can't stand this labeling of far right or far left just because a group of people have an objection to the current leadership. Because Canada currently has a ridiculous immigration policy these days and it's legitimately hurting Canadians. Everything is driven up and in high demand. Supply chains are stretched and inflation is rampant. It begs Canadians to ask, why are we bringing JNG so many people in when we can barely support our own? All fingers point at our current Liberal leadership and some corruption within. Canada allowed 400,000 immigrants in 1 quarter. 3 months. Which is about 1% of our population. That's absurd when you think about it. I see a lot of posters here claiming the people speaking up are bots, right-wing or conspiracy theorists. To answer your question, Canada is in an extreme housing crisis. Unless you're going to a rural area, for the most part, the country has become largely unaffordable. Rent has also skyrocketed due to fluctuating interest rates and the giant population boom, resulting in a huge discrepancy now between lower, middle and working class. Canadians are upset because a huge transfer of wealth is occurring. The healthcare is majorly falling apart, with many people waiting potentially years to be seen without a family doctor, and now having privatized healthcare introduced to combat the long wait times. Many people are not being seen on time, and because health professionals are being so heavily pressurized. Insane demands from a government who is not meeting their needs. Others are also noticing misdiagnosis being passed off. We will keep an eye on it. And again, being put on wait lists that seemingly never end. People feel their tax dollars are not being effectively used. The wages in Canada have not kept up with inflation. Most Canadians began demanding higher pay and refusing to work in jobs which didn't meet their needs. Instead of the government responding, they brought in temporary workers. Many of these workers were and are exploited, and because they're allowed to fill in these gaps, Canadians have not had any wage growth. Canadian students and youth are unable to get jobs and are now competing against a much larger demographic who, according to some, should not be brought in. There are also now subsidies the government pays which give these companies benefits for hiring. Outside of Canada, the government says Canadians won't work and they have a labor shortage. A lot of Canadians are saying, the companies won't pay and we have a wage shortage. The Canadian government has decided to implement something called the Century Initiative. Their idea is to boost the population to meet the growing concerns of an aging population. The problem is that the number of people they bring in is incompatible with the current structure. For example, our healthcare is barely functioning and we now have millions more trying to access it. Our housing is extremely expensive and we now have millions more competing for it. Our rent is insane and we now can barely find places which have less than 4 roommates for $700 or less. This number really depends on where you're at. Many students are not able to afford life in Canada and rely on Canadian social assistance to survive, such as food banks. A lot of Canadians feel, if they're unable to afford life here, they cannot be here. The additional argument is that this is the system used primarily globally. Those services are for Canadians in need. They are not for international students. Canadians, especially young Canadians, 2040, are struggling to find jobs which allow them to get further ahead. Struggling to pay their basic costs. Struggling to secure housing and overall, struggle to create a manageable future. The second part of this immigration wave is that the people being brought in are also students who are allowed to work 40 hours along with their family. They are passing out visas like candy to essentially everyone. Within this is first scams. A lot of colleges are now being called diploma mills. They're bringing in students who aren't actually studying and are working, especially trying to gain permanent residency. The government says this is generating jobs. Canadians are saying, this is taking away from the job market, adding to the wage suppression and creating a lower quality of life for all Canadians. International students are constantly complaining about how the government didn't provide them housing, how they got scammed, how they should be allowed to work limitless hours, bring their family over, etc., and getting priority over Canadians who have been paying into the Canadian system for generations. Many immigrants and other people defending these decisions are relying on Canadians feeling guilty and associating xenophobia, hence why this is being called a right-wing conspiratorial agenda. It's not. This is basic supply, demand. Many immigrants are very blatant that they are not here to study and are only here for permanent residency. In addition, while we are a multicultural society and an immigrant country, increasing violence is occurring. Because of the massive wealth gap occurring, many Canadians are feeling the squeeze, and due to the lack of effect response on drugs, many are becoming addicted and homeless. There have been a huge growing number of tent cities across the country. Overdoses, arrests and other crime. The government and larger corporations and universities, colleges, are benefiting enormously from these students financially. On a whole scale, growing tension is rising across the country. A lot of Canadians now argue the government does not have their best interest at hand. Again, online, you're seeing a lot of people shaming Canadians for standing up against this. There is nothing wrong with speaking up and defending your interests in your own country. My personal position: immigration is a huge part of the problem and not the only aspect. I'm for immigration when it's done at a calculated, rational level which takes into the account the well-being of everyone. Not people are just sick of unregulated immigration. You need to make $200K plus to afford the average home here. Rent is up record amounts. Food has quadrupled. Healthcare takes years to get even in life-threatening conditions. Justin Trudeau changed the immigration policy to welcome in record numbers of immigrants during a major housing and affordability crisis. People are pissed and becoming poorer and poorer while working more and harder. Conspiracies are easy to believe when you're desperate, and some parts of conspiracies to hold truth. I'm an immigrant myself, and the immigration process has changed a lot in the last 8 years. It used to be very difficult to get in. Now it's super easy to exploit, especially with student visas. That's just how bad it is, lol. It's just a thing in Canada where we like a guy for 8 years. Either side, liberal or conservative, and then hate him. I'm definitely not anti-immigration. I'm anti-500,000 people when real. Already Canadian citizens can't find housing, can't pay rent, groceries, bills, and struggle to heat their homes or drive to work. It's ridiculous that the government wants to bring in that many people rather than focusing on the thousands of Canadians who are currently struggling. It's not really a conspiracy, it's honestly a fact that 500,000 new people by 2026 is stupid and completely out of touch. We need immigrants. I know, but we should be helping current Canadians. After that, yes, we can take in immigrants. It's not a big deal after all, we need them. The 1% have been running their propaganda in Canada after a successful beta test in the US. Reddit isn't necessarily reality. It is a subculture of a population. Conspiracy theorists probably spend a lot of time on internet forums. I'm not blaming immigration. I'm blaming a government that keeps increasing the numbers when we have no housing available. Did you ever think to look into Trudeau's connections with the WEF and what their plans are for society? I guess you can't do that because it's just a right-wing talking point.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.